Hello, everybody. Welcome to Terrace View, Wisconsin Badgers chatter from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel. Oh, I got to update the logo on our YouTube feed. We have the old one, but a new one in Audio Boom, which is where you can find these podcasts, which feeds right into Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Hey, why don't you leave us a rating and review while you're at it? We need as much attention as we can get as we continue to get this plane off the ground. I am JR Radcliffe from the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and I am joined by my colleagues John Steppe, Mark Stewart. They cover the Wisconsin Badgers. You read everything they have at jsonline.com. We have some Badger events to discuss. Football recruiting, football transferring is still very much front of mind, and we will get to that in really short order here. But the men's basketball team, Mark, you did say last week that you just couldn't really envision a world where this team doesn't make the NCAA tournament, and then they pulled a win that definitely helped their cause. They go to Ann Arbor, beat undefeated, number 2 ranked Michigan, an absolute stunner, and somehow that was like very quickly forgotten as the chief highlight of the week, because then at the barn in Minneapolis, we get a three-pointer, an exciting three-pointer. Oh, I'm losing the light in my room. That's going to be an interesting development. We get a three-pointer at the buzzer from John Blackwell, answering Minnesota's own buzzer or late time three-pointer that tied the game. John Blackwell wins it with a true buzzer beater. Wild scenes, John Steppe, in Minnesota. So I want to start. I guess I have to start with that game because it was so exciting. You talked to John Blackwell about the development of that play. I feel like if they had lost that game, it would have been a heck of a loss after what they got in Michigan. So tell me about your takeaways from that game. Blackwell, Carrington, going back to Braden Carrington, going back to a school where he has played and getting booed and having the game of his life with a career high 21 points. What stuck out from Minneapolis?
Yeah, too bad I didn't have anything interesting to write about from that one. Nothing interesting whatsoever there. But I think really with these last two games, we've seen John Blackwell really play to the level that everyone was kind of thinking that he could play to. And, this team is at its best when John Blackwell is playing his best. And John Blackwell has delivered 2 just phenomenal performances in the last 2 games. I think it's 27 points against Minnesota and 26 against Michigan. I know that those aren't his season high, but I would just overall say that these last 2 performances have been all around his best 2 performances. And that's really been huge for the Badgers. Braden Carrington, what a great storyline there in terms of, he gets booed from the moment he checks in for the first time. Every time he touches the ball, they're booing. And career high 21 points. And what he's done, obviously the 3-pointers are going to be a memorable thing from this last game against Minnesota, but also what he's done on the defensive end, his ability to rebound as a guard, a lot of different things he's been able to do that's really been helpful. And, an interesting thing from Minnesota game and, Michigan game too, is we've seen some more resiliency from this Badgers team. You look at it, and there are a lot of games early on that, gets out of hand, and, once it's off the rails, Wisconsin just can't get it back on the rails. You look at how the BYU game unraveled fast. You think about how Nebraska unraveled fast. Villanova, they forced overtime after a bad first half, but still, ultimately losing that game. Now you're seeing some more resiliency, some more ability to bounce back. You look at it and, it felt like when I was at the Chrysler Center and it was 31-17, my first thought was, okay, we've seen this one before. But no, we didn't end up seeing what we saw before in terms of the way that Wisconsin really fought back. They've shown, their defense still has work to do, but we've seen that defense be able to have some really solid stretches when they've needed it, in order to kind of give them a chance to get back in it. In terms of coming back from 31-17 against Michigan and coming back from down 11 against Minnesota. We've seen some more, the word that, Greg Gard constantly uses is fight, and more connectiveness and more of a collective fight that this Wisconsin team has shown. And that's really made a big difference in terms of, a week ago, this team was very much on the outside of the NCAA tournament bubble. And now, pretty much every bracket projection, very understandably so, has Wisconsin in the tournament field. And, maybe even with a little bit of cushion. I say a little bit. There's still a long ways to go. I think I said last week that, this could be a roller coaster season. So there are going to be ups and downs. But they've played themselves into a much different conversation. No surprise when you beat Michigan, who was number 1 in the USA Today coaches poll, number 2 in the AP poll, on the road. Wisconsin really didn't have that signature win until then. And they went from not having a signature win, not having a quad 1 win, to having about as good of a win as you could possibly ask for on the resume.
Mark Stewart, because we'll come back to you, John, here and talk more basketball in a second. But Mark, did you know something? You knew this team was going to get back into it. You saw the future. Give me your thoughts from. I know you weren't at these games, but give me your thoughts on where you thought see this team, or where you have seen this team come here in the last 2 weeks.
Well, a couple things. One, excuse my hoarse voice. I'm toughing it out. Two, I don't know where my light went, but all of a sudden the sunlight that was coming from the window, I lost that. So all of a sudden my area is dark. So at some point I might pop out and turn the light on up there. But what stood out to me in these last couple of games is, John talked about John Blackwell, and to be a great team, you do need your stars to perform well, but you also need some other guy to kind of step up that maybe you're not expecting. And at Michigan, it was
Bilyauskas, yep.
Bilyauskas. At Minnesota, it was Carrington, who just watching him, you could tell he was loving it. He was like, just bring the booze on. I'm sure he was expecting it, and he comes back and just seemed like he couldn't miss. So I mean, that's kind of what stands out. It's like, to beat these great teams, one, your stars got to play well, but there's got to be a surprise somewhere. In these last couple games, we saw that surprise in Carrington and Bilyauskas, and like I say, it's they're making me look good. Like I said, I mean, I guess I've watched a lot of Wisconsin basketball in the last couple decades, and history just as always tells me that usually they're going to figure it out at some point.
John, I want to talk more about Carrington, because it wasn't even just that game against Minnesota. That's where he scored all those points, but even the 12 points he had against Michigan were pretty impressive. He came in and really is clearly very confident out there. And this is a team that's already a little shorthanded because Austin Rapp has been down and has struggled to start his career even before that. So they kind of, they had to turn to somebody new, like Mark said, and Carrington really seemed to fit that role. He's shooting the ball well. Sometimes I wonder if I look at these two games, it's just like, if the Badgers hit all, a gajillion 3-pointers, they're probably going to win. And that seems like an unsustainable way to have, to stack up victories, but I don't want to get there yet. Where did Braden Carrington come from? Like, give me your thoughts on, I mean, you can even give some background. I imagine there are plenty of Badger fans that don't even know literally where he came from, let alone how he emerged into being such a reliable contributor.
Yeah, I think anybody who didn't know that he started his career at Minnesota learned that pretty quickly when he checked in and heard that reaction. And he did say that he expected it. This had happened before with other players. So, he knew this was coming, and, he delivered the performance where he really was the one to get the last laugh. But, you mentioned the 12 points against Michigan. The stat that impresses me more is 9 rebounds. You look at the size that Michigan has, and that's where I thought it was really going to be a challenge for Wisconsin going into that game. But he led Wisconsin with rebounds, at, what is he listed officially? 6'5", something like that. So, what he's been able to do in terms of his rebounding as a guard, what he's been able to do defensively, you look at it, and a lot of those little things, yes, the 3-point shooting is exciting. They don't win, this last game without his 3-point shooting. But, a lot of the other things he's been doing has really been a difference maker. And especially when, particularly with Minnesota, they didn't necessarily go into a deep lineup. I think it was 6 players that played the last 15 minutes of the game. And, Alexis Bielyauskas going into foul trouble certainly was a factor there. He picked up his 4th foul. I think it's at like the 15-25 mark or something like that. So, he was quite limited there. But you look at it and he really gives this small ball lineup that Wisconsin has turned to increasingly, with their lack of depth in the front court. He's really been a key part of that. The way that he's been able to play the 4, the way that Jack Janicki has been able to play the 4, that has allowed them to kind of pull this off. And, it's not just him too. Nolan Winter, I think, was on the bench for 67 seconds against Minnesota. So, there's been a lot of players who've stepped up, but Carrington certainly, you saw some, moments like this earlier in the season. I can't remember. I think it's one of the exhibition games. I saw some things where I was like, okay, this guy can play. And then, he had, some rough, stretches earlier on. And, I think probably the competition within this guard group does help too. In terms of, Zach Kinzinger has been able to provide some competition in practices. Hayden Jones has been able to provide some competition in practices. And, I think sometimes it helps when you have some other guys that can kind of push you there. But, this is probably, as good of a stretch as you could ask for from Braden Carrington. And, it's a lot to ask for in terms of him continuing to play quite at this level. But we've seen kind of what he can do in terms of helping Wisconsin in a lot of ways, not just the 3-point shooting, but when the 3-point shooting does go down the way that it was, that certainly helps and certainly makes up for some other shortcomings with this Wisconsin team.
When you went to Ann Arbor, and I think I flippantly said at one of the last podcasts, oh, great, they're going to Michigan to face maybe the best team in the nation. How's that going to go? When you went there, I don't know if there's any evidence you would have had that suggested that was going to be a worthwhile trip. The Badgers had no quad 1 wins, as Mark pointed out last week. They had not been competitive in quad 1 opportunities. Yes, you got 5 3-pointers from Bielyauskas. That was awesome. It still, I think, required quite a bit to go right for that team to come away with an upset victory. Can you distill it down to 1 or 2 things? Is it just, they hit all their threes? Or is it, was a switch flipped? I mean, how would you say that Badgers team that we have not seen play at that level could go into Ann Arbor and beat an undefeated team? Quite honestly, a team I did think is the best in the country. And, that second half, they were just the better team in the second half, which I guess I was not prepared for.
Yeah, a lot of it goes back to Blackwell in terms of, I think when you have a star player that wasn't playing like a star for, some of those losses that they had, whether that be the Nebraska loss, whether that be the Villanova loss, it makes it a lot harder. When you have Blackwell going, 9 of 16 for 26 points against Michigan, that helps you out a lot. I think particularly with that game, I liked how Wisconsin was able to, they didn't try to beat Michigan at Michigan's own strengths. You look at it and the way that they're able to use Nolan Winter, the way that they're able to use Alexis Bielyauskas, that really, they have some skilled big men. Obviously they can both hit the 3-point shot. And I think we saw Wisconsin kind of play to its strengths and kind of have, I wouldn't necessarily say everything clicked, but, you had enough things click with Wisconsin playing Wisconsin basketball really well. That was as difficult of a matchup as I thought they were going to face just because of that size. And because, in the past, they had been kind of bullied by some teams. I think of TCU as one where they just got out physical by them, turning that into a word. But, that didn't really happen against Michigan. Wisconsin was able to counter it with a way that really fits this roster. And, I think this roster is gelling better. And I think there's probably some better leadership too. Or, the leadership was there, but, they're responding better when things don't quite go their way. Going back to the 31-17 deficit in the first half, things didn't unravel. So, they still have work to do. The Michigan game looks different if, Alexis doesn't hit those 4 3-pointers in a row, 5 total. The Minnesota game looks different if Carrington and Blackwell don't single-handedly, or I guess double-handedly, since there's 2 of them, go on that 14-0 run, where they had all 14 points. Those games look different if those things don't happen. But you're seeing, some encouraging signs that we didn't see a month ago. Frankly, we didn't really even see necessarily 2 weeks ago for extended stretches.
The rest of the schedule here in January is full of winnable games, starting with the Saturday battle against Rutgers. This team could be right back on track, like you said, already starting to sneak into some of these bracket projections. It would be it's quite the turn of events for the Wisconsin men's basketball team. Mark, let's pivot to football. There have been so many new people added through the transfer portal. There have been some losses. Joe Brunner, Emilio Agard come to mind. Joe Brunner committing to Indiana, of course, a team that's on the precipice of a national championship. So that's, I think, pretty notable. But a couple guys came back. Charles Perkins, who probably is going to be their best defensive tackle as things stand right now next year. Eugene Hilton, the son of T.Y. Hilton. He returned. Really an exciting receiver prospect that I think a lot of people were bummed to see go. So that, I guess, gives you a little hint that they're at least, some guys are like, actually, maybe I do want to stay at Wisconsin, because they have added a bunch of guys. I know that, like you mentioned, Justice Boone from Arkansas as a pass rusher, as a guy who might be a key contributor right out of the gate, possibly their number one starter at the position next year. But what other names do we have? I mean, maybe, if I had you just like tell me a couple thoughts on a couple of the guys that have transferred in, you wrote about Colton Joseph again, the quarterback at jsonline.com. Maybe it just still all comes back to the quarterback, and now he's got another quarterback who's been brought in as well, which we'll talk about. But can you give me any guidance, any roadmap on some of these names that we've seen return or join the program that we could be safely assume they are going to be big time contributors next year?
Well, a couple names that come to mind. You mentioned Emilio Agard deciding to transfer. I don't know specifically why. We never know for the most part. I just saw he recently committed to Virginia, so it didn't take him long to land on his feet. But Wisconsin's made a lot of strides in, and sorry for my voice, but I'm just going to keep grinding through it.
That's all right. You got it.
I'm going to pretend that I sound like I normally do and take a sip of water every now and then. But the secondary, I'm very interested in what they've done in the secondary. They brought in some guys, Kai Bates, Bryce West. Kai Bates was from Florida State. Bryce West, former Ohio State guy. These are former 4-star cornerbacks with, 3 years of eligibility left, that might turn into, Wisconsin might be the place that, their skills are unlocked. They got a safety, Marvin Burks from Missouri. He's pretty tough. Javon Robinson, a cornerback from Arizona State. He's probably going to be a starter.
For sure.
He's got starting experience there. So, I think that last year they revamped the defensive front, and we're seeing this year that they're kind of retooling certain areas, and secondary is one of them. A lot of new faces on the offensive line as well. I know it's not a sexy position, but a lot of new faces there that I'm interested just to see how it works out, because you have some young guys like Emerson Mandel, who's your starting right tackle. He'll be a redshirt sophomore. Colin Coverly was your right guard. He was a redshirt freshman last year, so it's going to be interesting to see how Wisconsin blends these older veteran linemen that they brought in with some of this young promising talent. Joe Brunner's departure, they probably already knew that as they were bringing these guys in.
For sure.
It kind of makes more sense that okay, why they were bringing so many linemen in. But those are a couple areas. Um, and we didn't even mention the running backs. Abu Sama from Iowa State, um, huge pickup there. He's probably going to be a starter. Um, it's just an intriguing group. It's not rated high for whatever reason, but um, but there are a lot of pieces that I think the Wisconsin coaches believe fit what they want to do. So once we get to spring practice, it's going to be interesting to kind of see how it all looks together.
Yeah, I want to go back to offensive line. They have brought in a few guys, and Kevin Haywood will hopefully be healthy next year. But does it work? Would you be worried that, I mean, this is a position that they were clearly undermanned, both in terms of top talent and depth in recent years. And have they done enough to address that? Like to me, it feels a little bit like in past years where, like, if one or two guys goes down, suddenly you are staring down a very problematic situation. And I think you could definitely argue that part of they had these talented running backs that couldn't get off the ground because the offensive line just wasn't blocking for them. How do you look at that position specifically? Do you think that there is still more that the Badgers have to do?
I mean, I think they've done plenty. I mean, I think they brought in a lot of competition for playing time. I also think that they've kind of sort of, you know, filled out some of the holes that they lost at that position 2 years ago. They had a ton of offensive linemen transfer out of the program. And I think when you talk about that depth that was missing this year, I think that was one of the residual effects of guys leaving 2 years ago. Because if you look around, you saw Dylan Barrett starting at Iowa State. He was a former Wisconsin guy. Todd Rucci starting at tackle at Penn State, another former Wisconsin guy. And those are two guys at positions that they really needed help at this year. So, um, I mean, I do really think they've helped that position. They brought in more competition, and I think that's what Fickle likes is just having guys compete and elevating the level of play in that room. Let's be honest, for all the talent that we think guys like Riley Mallman and Joe Brunner have and their potential to play at the NFL level, that line didn't gel for whatever reason. And, so kind of as you mentioned, a week or two ago, no one is, I know they suffered some losses there, but, can you say you really miss those guys given the performance of the whole group? So, um, I do like the depth there. And I do like the competition aspect and the fact that, where are they going to put guys? Is Emerson Mandel going to be your right tackle? Can they put him back inside? He's a guy that has versatility. It's going to be an interesting group to see how it unfolds.
Before we leave football, you were mentioning the Badgers also got a pretty high level recruit for a couple classes from now. Guy out of Iola, Scandinavia, who is considered the top prospect in in the state of Wisconsin. That's a step forward for a program that has taken some criticism for not bringing in the top guys in the state of Wisconsin. And now that they have that announcement, I don't know. It's one guy. It doesn't mean anything in terms of trend, but that probably is pretty satisfying for the Wisconsin recruiting staff. Tell me what you know about that situation and what you thought of that decision that just came down a few days ago.
Coors Loken is his name. He's from Iola, Scandinavia. Great name. You're not going to forget it.
I didn't
And
say it because I was going to get it wrong. Thank goodness you picked up on that. Like, oh, if I say it, I'm not sure I have all the syllables right. I'm glad you got that.
yeah, I mean, I think this was huge for Wisconsin just from the optics of it. I mean, you have a guy that goes on national TV at the Navy All American game in San Antonio and announces that he's coming to Wisconsin. He's got the hat from Notre Dame up there. He's got, I think, Kansas was up there, Iowa State, and he picks Wisconsin. And he speaks glowingly of the program on a national level to a national audience. And so, one, I just think it was huge for the program from that standpoint, especially when you look at what they were doing in the transfer portal. That first week of the transfer portal was really hot for Wisconsin. Guys coming in left and right. and I think his commitment adds some excitement to that. He was injured most of last year, so this upcoming senior season, will be probably the first time we've seen him in a lot of action in 2 years. But he's like a top 4 tight end at his position nationally. And, we know how Jeff Grimes likes his tight ends. So I think that's going to be it's interesting position to see, down the road how he fits in that Wisconsin offense. But, I can't speak of any more of how big of a recruit that is and just the timing of it all.
Yeah, tight end actually a pretty interesting spot now going forward. Will it be Grant Steck who kind of rises to the forefront? Jackson McGowan. You got a couple newcomers in Ryan Schwenden and Jacob Harris. So I'm actually curious how that unfolds as well for the 2026 season, let alone now what's being worked on here for the 2027 season. Mark, one last football question. I do feel like maybe this is just anecdotal, but it feels like a lot of these guys are here with multiple years of eligibility remaining. You wrote about this at jsonline.com, writing about these like former 4-star guys, that this is sort of a land of opportunity for them. They maybe didn't quite get out of the gates the way they would have wanted to in college. So now Wisconsin gets a chance to sort of be a second stop for these guys, nurture that 4-star potential and kind of bring these guys to the forefront, in more of a developmental capacity, more of the traditional way of building a football team. Do you get the sense, because we've talked about how the schedule is pretty forgiving this next year for Wisconsin in 2026, do you get the sense this is a 2027 build? Even Colton Joseph could theoretically be here in 2027. Do you get the sense that is their target, or is that oversimplifying that they do still want to be a competitive team in 2026?
No, I think they still want to be competitive. I think they need to be, just given the situation with the coaching staff and Luke Fickell,
Of course.
2 back-to-back losing seasons. You got to put something together this year. And honestly, I don't think they're really looking ahead too much to 2027. I know that, Fickell liked the idea of having Colton Joseph as a quarterback with 2 years of eligibility left, so that potentially next year he wouldn't have to go through this cycle of finding a new quarterback again. But, the nature of college football is that just because these guys are here this year doesn't mean they're going to be here next year. Some of these former 4-star recruits that we mentioned, this could be a situation where, we kind of brought up the Milwaukee Brewer example where, you get these guys and you kind of buy low, and then at some point, maybe they become too expensive for you, and then they move on to somewhere else. So you never know what's going to happen with those guys next year. I think they're really just focused on getting as much talent in the room and creating as much competition at various spots, and then letting the best guys, decide it out. Look at what they did at inside linebacker. You would think Wisconsin doesn't need any more inside linebackers, and yet they pick up a guy from Kansas. I'm blanking on his name, John something. Sorry, I'll remember it later. But this is a guy, he comes in, he's got 3 years of eligibility left in a room that's loaded with young guys. So, I think Wisconsin's mindset, at least it appears to me, that they just want to get bodies in the room, create depth, create competition. And when you do those 2 things, the end result on the field, should be better.
John, let's pivot back to basketball for a second. You had written at jsonline.com about Brad Davison, of course, a very familiar face in Wisconsin basketball circles. He is back with the program, had played professionally briefly. I actually talked to him, speaking of a Brewers connection, I talked to him last year for our Brewers podcast, because he happened to be high school teammates with Isaac Collins, an outfielder who had a breakout season for the Brewers, and then ended up getting traded this offseason to Kansas City. At the time, did not know that Brad Davison would be back on the bench, serving in a capacity with the Wisconsin men's basketball team. What sorts of things does he do? What does he bring to the? You had a chance to chat with him. What does he bring to the equation?
Yeah, I'd say a bunch of things. I think some of them were anticipated benefits, and maybe some of them not necessarily unanticipated, but maybe even better than expected. I think everyone expected that. I think anybody that spent time around Brad knows that he has the personality for it. He has the leadership for it. There were times where he's kind of a little bit like a coach, during his playing career. I think Nolan Winter was the one who said, how he was kind of that glue guy, when he was a player. And, as a coach, you've seen a lot of those same things. His ability to relate to players. The players right now on this team, a lot of them have seen Brad Davison play in the not so distant past. Andrew Rohde, growing up in Brookfield, was well aware of Brad Davison's ability to take charges. So I think you have somebody that can kind of be, like one player said, kind of a bridge between, the coaching staff and players, somebody that's really relatable. So there's certainly that aspect of it. Greg Gard was also really complimentary of his mind for the game. And, that has really helped Wisconsin from a scouting standpoint in terms of scouting opposing offenses. So, it's still early within his coaching career. You can tell he's quite happy to be back in Madison. And, it really seems like it's been, Wisconsin was not going to replace Kirk Penny with Kirk Penny 2.0. They're going to go with somebody that brought some different strengths. And I think the strengths that Brad Davison has brought to the staff have really been helpful. And, I talked, about, the relatability of players. And, when you have a group that has 8 newcomers, that's certainly not a strength to be taken lightly. So, he brings a lot to the table. And I think probably the even more exciting thing is how much more, there is. They're, I'm sure, going to find other ways to really take advantage of, when Greg Gard is complimenting, Brad's basketball mind like that, they're going to find other ways too, where that can be useful. So, I think we're probably just scratching the surface of, his overall coaching impact. But certainly relatability, basketball mind, he's kind of provided a little bit of everything here with the, special assistant to the head coach role.
As we wind down here, Mark, I want to hear a little bit about the men's hockey team. They start, as we record this on Thursday, 2-game set with Michigan State. Wisconsin, number 2 in the men's hockey NCAA rankings. Michigan State, number 4. So that's a pretty big matchup. This Wisconsin team has been very good. Michigan, number 1 in the country. They show up again later on the schedule as we get toward the home stretch. They are not losing players to the Olympics like the women's hockey team is. We'll be talking more about them next week, I believe, on an upcoming episode. I got a special guest that'll hopefully be joining us to chat about the women's hockey team and their many, many Olympic contributors. But give me what you know about the men's team. What should people know if they are not following the Wisconsin men's hockey team that they might want to know?
Well, I mean, I guess the big thing with them is, they just have one that they've got there's a lot of weapons that they have. And, one of their problems last year was winning close games. And, this was a team that their record was really, really poor last year, but they were in a lot of games. And this year they really kind of, flipped that. And one of the teams they flipped it against is Michigan State. Michigan State kind of had their number the last couple of years. And for Wisconsin to get that sweep earlier this year at East Lansing was huge. The other thing I kind of find intriguing is, they've got, they got a young goalkeeper, Daniel Hauser. He's been playing pretty well. I think this is just a team they've got a lot of pieces that are coming together. Quinn Finley, Wisconsin native. Ironically, the only Wisconsin native I think on the roster.
I don't know if it's that ironic. That's typically how this rolls in hockey. There are the Cole Caulfields and Joe Pavelskis of the world, but for the most part, we're talking Canadians and guys who aren't Wisconsinites.
Yeah, I think like the outside perception is that Wisconsin is almost like Minnesota East a little bit, where guys are out on the pond and they're skating, and it's like Indiana kids shooting hoops in the backyard. But it's just there are a lot of guys. And one thing I've noticed about this team is like on a game-to-game basis, it's different people. Last week they played Acreage, and it's Quinn Finley one night, and it's defenseman Ben Dexheimer the next night, and it's Daniel Hauser making some wild, some key saves. It's a fun group to watch. And then we're getting to that time of the year where the crowds are starting to get a little bigger. I'm interested to see what kind of crowd they get for this weekend. Thursday night action at the Kohl Center. Like I say, it's just a fun group to watch, and they're kind of, I think they figured a lot of things out from last year's struggles.
John, any final thoughts here? One thing I did not circle back to, and you're welcome to speak to it, or anything on the football side. Deuce Adams, another quarterback transferring into the program, which I thought was kind of interesting because, of course, they have Colton Joseph. They have a couple incumbents, Danny O'Neill coming off a major injury, but then also Carter Smith, who stepped in as a true freshman. Any thoughts on like what his addition means for those other guys in the quarterback room, or purely like what you think he could do, and if not football, whatever else strikes your fancy about Wisconsin athletics?
Yeah, the thing I think about with quarterbacks in the portal is, it's a position where you need more than just one. And this last Wisconsin football season was the picture perfect example of why, you need some depth sometimes at that position. And obviously you hope that your starter is able to stay healthy. And, that's something that Wisconsin hasn't necessarily enjoyed lately, but certainly something you hope for. But, you need to have other guys, waiting in the wings for whatever reason. So depth is always a plus there. I think in general with football, it's going to be a really important spring practice season. It always is important from a development standpoint. And it's going to be a really important fall camp in Platteville, assuming they go back to Platteville again. Again, always important, but especially when you have this many moving pieces, this is not like drafting your fantasy football roster where, it's not like you can just throw in a bunch of names, and week one, okay, this is probably going to take some time to gel, and how they gel is really interesting to me. A lot of these guys have a lot of potential. At the same time, a lot of these guys, there might be a reason why it didn't work out in the first place. So, what Wisconsin is trying to do in terms of this kind of major retooling of the roster within 1 year isn't easy. So I think that's going to be a really interesting thing to watch in the offseason. I guess in the shorter term, Wisconsin athletics related, this is being exciting next couple months of basketball where, I think I said last episode that it's going to be a roller coaster. You have some very winnable games for the rest of January. It's very realistic that they could go 5-0 in these last, I believe it's 5 games. Yeah. Left in the month of January. So, that is quite feasible. And then you get into a really difficult February schedule. Mm-hmm. So it's going to be interesting. I certainly feel better about this team than I did a week ago. I would caution against, the Sweet 16 hopes quite yet. I would say, there are going to be ups and downs, and we'll see where this ends up being in March.
Yeah, I think I feel similarly cautious. Like they needed to shoot the lights out to win these last 2 games. And granted, they also missed a couple free throws against Minnesota that made that a contest late. And I don't think that's going to happen often with Wisconsin, but like that, like they kind of blew a lead there. Like could have easily lost that game. And the Michigan game, again, required the best performance of the year by far. I don't know if I can expect that to continue, but the schedule does offer some hope. Mark, I'll give you the last word. Anything else that you got rolling around your brain that you want to talk about?
I guess I was just going to piggyback on 2 things. People out there don't know that I was making a subtle dig at our fantasy football league. Because he did well this year, knocked me out of the postseason, but that's okay.
That's tough.
But I will say about the quarterback situation, again, you want competition for that backup job. Colton Joseph is clearly your number one. Whoever, if you need your number two, you want that guy to be sharp and really to have earned that position. And the way it sounds now is I would be surprised if Danny O'Neil is physically ready to compete for the backup job. It was, the way Luke Fickle said it last week was that, at the earliest, he would be ready for fall camp. So it's possible, with that Achilles injury that, it's going to take longer to heal. So, so yeah, so as far as Carter and Deuce go, you want those guys really compete for that number two job. And, if they need him, if they need that backup quarterback, he's been, as the football guys like to say, uh, iron sharpening iron, so to speak, against each other in practice.
John Steppe, Mark Stewart, again, everything they have at jsonline.com. They are our tireless Badgers reporters. They have everything covered from basketball to football to hockey and everything in between. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me once again on this episode of Terrace View. We'll be back again, chatting again next week. Take care.